overall, I would say that he was the most consequential prime minister India has had since Jawaharlal Nehru. And it's a shame that I even have to say this. And it's only because he's getting a Bharat Ratna that people are even talking about him.
The government's surprise decision to award Bharat Ratna to PV Narasimha Rao is being seen as a part of its larger narrative to discredit Congress. By doing so, it seems BJP is playing to the narrative of how Congress ignores people outside the Gandhi family. But who is PV Narasimha Rao? And what is his legacy that Congress seems to be so desperate to bury? I have with me Vinay Sitapati, who teaches law and politics and has written two books, one of which is on PV Narasimha Rao itself, Half Lion, How PV Narasimha Rao Transformed India, and another one, Jugalbandi, BJP Before Modi. Welcome, Vinay, and thank you for joining us. Vinay, first of all, my first question to you would be, how exactly did now Bharat Ratna PV Narasimha Rao change India?
Well, for the Gen Zs who are seeing this, they won't remember standing in line, for anything, right? But remember, that was a moment in which you couldn't call even outside your city without booking a trunk call, right? It was the time of shortages. It was the time of the ambassador car and the kind of the Maruti 800. Narasimha Rao changed all that. He was Prime Minister of India from 1991 to 1996. He caused, there's no other way to describe that, huge changes to the Indian economy. He removed the red tape that prevented Indian entrepreneurs from making in India and providing services in India. And he opened up India for global trade, services, and capital. The Indian economy that you see today, the growing Indian economy, is all thanks to him. Keep in mind that he wasn't an ideas man when it came to the economy. The ideas were there, through the 80s. There was report after report, and he had Manmohan Singh to help him. His ability was to navigate the politics of reform. The main opponents of reform were opposition parties, trade unions, domestic capitalists, and above all else, the Congress party that was wedded to Nehruvian socialism. He had to navigate all that to open up India's economy. So that's the number one reason why you should know him. But the other things I talk about in the book is that he really created this Labharti culture that everyone is talking about now. For the first time, many state welfare schemes, midday meals, etc., came to the national level because of him. He had to navigate India's foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the gradual move towards the West in India began because of him. India was in crisis at that time when it came to territorial integrity. Kashmir as well as Punjab had gone out of India's control. He was able to get it back in India's control. He had noticeable failures. I would say the biggest one is during the anti-Sikh riots of 1984, he was the home minister. That's a big failure. Babri Masjid was a failure. It's not as big as people make it out to be in terms of blaming him. He acted as a politician. He should have acted as a statesman. But really, he wasn't more to blame than anyone else. But yes, there are pros and cons. But overall, I would say that he was the most consequential prime minister India has had since Jawaharlal Nehru. And it's a shame that I even have to say this. And it's only because he's getting a Bharat Ratna that people are even talking about him.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, and in a lot of talks I've noticed, you mentioned that, he was perceived as a boring prime minister. He used to belong to that, that ilk of boring prime ministers like H.D. Deve Gowda, you mentioned in the same breath. But yet this man was so dynamic in so many ways, right? So if you could tell us, how the perception around him was created, or how he was so different from the perception that people have of him.
Well, so the one way in which the perception is true is that he was a boring man. He lacked charisma. I think the Congress leader, Jairam Ramesh, told me that he had the charisma of a dead fish. It is true, right? Just see him on YouTube. He doesn't speak much. He speaks long. But where the perception is wrong in thinking about him as a man of paralysis, a man who didn't do too many things, people provide the backhanded compliment that he was a scholar who knew 10 languages. The assumption is he didn't do much. He was always thinking. That's not true at all. He was very dynamic. He knew how to act. His talent was that when the political forces didn't allow him to move, he didn't move. But where he saw an opening, he was able to move fast, he was able to be dynamic. But this myth of the man who was silent in 10 languages, actually the biggest culprit for that myth is Narasimha Rao. You have to understand, and your viewers have to understand, that when you have a very large system, that system doesn't like change and reform. Narasimha Rao's genius was to pretend to continuity while bringing about radical change. In that scenario, he can't be batting on the front foot. He has to pretend to be like Dravid, but the runs that are scored have to be like Virat Kohli. That is Narasimha Rao's genius and his strength. So the boring sort of the backroom boy persona was also in part because of Narasimha Rao's deliberate choice of hiding change under the garb of status quo.
And also, you mentioned in a lot of interviews and also in your book that he came during a time of immense turbulence, right? In 1991, his tenure was preceded and followed by really unstable governments. So, if you could tell us about, if you give us that context.
Let's look at all the ways in which Narasimha Rao inherited the inbox from hell when he became prime minister in 1991. One, his own Congress party was not in majority in government, right? The two governments before him, collapsed within a year each. They were also minority governments. The three governments after him collapsed roughly within a year each. So that was a period in which if you don't get a majority of your own, you just can't survive for 5 years. He did survive, right? So firstly, despite being a minority government, he was able to survive. Secondly, even within his own party, he was hated. Keep in mind that the leader of the party was Rajiv Gandhi, and Narasimha Rao had basically retired when he was called back to become prime minister because Rajiv Gandhi had died. And he, by virtue of being the least ambitious man in the party, or so everybody thought, was the consensus candidate, right? And so he inherited a party that hated him. That was what he inherited when he became prime minister in mid 1991. He had to navigate his party, right? He had to navigate Sharad Pawar, Arjun Singh, ND Tiwari, and of course, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who didn't quite take a shine to him, and the feeling was reciprocated, right? Third is, as we discussed earlier, he was unlike Indira Gandhi or Narendra Modi, not a charismatic man. If he were to speak in a large hall to explain liberalization, everybody would go to sleep, right? Plus, not only did he inherit these political weaknesses, look at the circumstances around him, right? The Soviet Union is in slow collapse. This is India's best friend on the world stage. India is on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall. It has to make adjustments. The Indian economy is, as is famous now, tanking. We have to go with a begging bowl towards the International Monetary Fund. And parts of India are ungovernable, right? Elections can't be held in Kashmir and Punjab because the Indian state simply cannot guarantee elections. This is the inbox from hell he inherited. In these circumstances, if he had just lasted for 5 years, we would have said miracle. He not just lasted for 5 years, but brought about radical changes that we're talking about even today, the economy being just one of them. And I think there's no historical example of a man bringing out so much change with such a weak hand. That is the key.
And lastly, what would you say is PV Narasimha Rao's most enduring legacy?
Well, I think there are many things. I think one, big one is that on the economy, India does best when the state recedes, right? But I think the other legacy, even outside of politics, that any of your viewers should realize is that if you want to bring about change, not only do you have to bring about that change, but you have to safeguard your mandate in doing it. That mandate is not God-given. It's not that an organization gives you power and then you have all the power to change. You have to create power. You have to construct influence in order to bring about change. And that, I think, even outside of politics, whether you're in management, if you're working in any institution, even if you're a journalist, to bring about good, you first have to construct enough power and influence to be able to do it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Vinay. Thanks for joining us. And keep
Thank
on
you.
Indian Express's YouTube channel for more videos. Thank you.